So we're talking about some of the aggressive attacking play. We're talking about some of the midfielders getting in front of the forwards. Now the other theme I want to talk about, and it's going to kind of touch on Apex's point here: Napoli, Inter, and Milan, looking like teams that would do amazing in Europe. And here's what we've seen through two games with all three of those teams. Well, one goals obviously, and then it's Inter far more, probably Inter much more so than Napoli and Milan. Have Inter? I'll pose this question to you:
All right.
has Inter turned into a team that they're far? Have they now? I'm just trying to word this right.
All right.
Bonetti's in the house.
Hey, look at this.
Man, we got to up our game. Forza Serie A sit down. Good to have you with us, Matteo.
Yes, sir.
Here's what I observe now with Inter,
All right.
and to a little bit lesser extent Napoli and Milan. But I think the experiences that Inter have gone through, getting all the way to a Champions League final. Okay, I think the experiences from that game, and I want your comments on this. They've learned how to be a team that just that goes out and gets what they need. They've basically turned into game managers. Okay, because they went to Cagliari and they got two quick goals and then they just managed their way through the game. I don't know if it's,
Allegri-esque.
well, I don't know, not to that degree. I mean, Allegri will just put you to sleep with the way his teams play sometimes.
Yeah.
But Napoli are a little bit more ruthless. They score two, they're looking for three, and they're looking for four. Milan scored four at the weekend. But even when Milan beat Bologna 2-0, they got their two, and then with the conditions of the game, the heat probably had a little bit to do with it. They kind of managed their way through the game too and said, all right, we've got our two. Let's just not give anything away cheap and let them back in the game. I'm starting to see Inter do a lot of that, where they get their lead and then they just don't allow anything cheap to happen, where the opponent can have a chance to be back in the game. And Cagliari might not be the greatest. Cagliari and Monza might not be the greatest examples of this. We'll find out when they have to play against better teams. Yeah. But your thoughts on that? Because that's kind of what I'm noticing. Watching that Cagliari-Inter game on Monday, it's not that they Inter take their foot off the gas, but they're avoiding allowing themselves to give up anything cheap.
We should retitle this podcast to Evolutions, right? Because I think it's the evolution of Simone Inzaghi and Inter. They're adding another facet to their game that maybe they didn't have so much last year, and they learned it through the Champions League run that they went on. But they are becoming a team that can play in multiple different situations. We talked about, I think early last year, maybe the year before, that they have a plan A and maybe a plan B, but after that it kind of drops off. And now they're starting to add all these different elements to them. They're a super deep team. Obviously, finding a new role for Calhanoglu in the regista position that he's kind of flourishing at the moment. And so game management is part of that. And if you want to be in these games, first of all, get two goals early on, which is great, and then they see the game out. They didn't have to do too much, right? They didn't have to put too much. They can kind of reserve their energy for later in the season when they need it, and that's what good teams do. We talked early in the season about that cutthroat mentality. Yes, it's needed at times, but in games like this, if you have a defense like Inter does, you don't need to do that. You can just old Allegri 1.0. You get the goals you need and set up shop and block everything off and don't create any shot. Sommer two clean sheets in 2 games, right? Everyone's wondering, asking what Onana's doing over there at Manchester United. Sommer's a good goalkeeper, and he's looking at. He hasn't been challenged yet. None of the big three have been challenged yet. But I think this is an evolution to their game. Is this going to be how they play all season long? No. When it's required, they will play. But I can see if they go down a goal against any team, it's going to be a very attack, or let the other team have the ball and play the counter-attack system. They have different facets to them now that make them even more dangerous, not only in Serie A, but also in Champions League, which is what, Simone Inzaghi is a cup merchant, as is like Pioli is, right? I think what Simone Inzaghi is doing in the season with the cup this year, I think he's just going to keep it at this top level and, barring any mental collapses from Inter, this is the Inter we're going to see, a team that can shut it down when they need to, or, be a little bit more open and score some goals. I mean, they have wonderful players all over the pitch, and the pieces are fitting in together really nicely right now. So, kudos to Inzaghi, what he's done, how he's evolved as a manager. Great manager.
Goes a long way when you can just return just about everybody.
Yeah.
You know,
And
the
Pavard
one,
is coming.
yeah, you can plug Sommer in goal to your point, and then the striker that supports Martinez. And in this case, you've got Thuram, who's, and we talked about this on last week's podcast. The contrast between Thuram and Arnautovic, where Thuram can, the work rate's through the roof. Where Arnautovic probably plays a little bit higher. He's a target, even though he had a very nice assist for Lautaro in the Monza win.
Yeah.
From a wide area. Well, let's be realistic. He shot that, and and Lautaro happened to tap.
I like
it in.
Arnautovic, so I do like
Yeah.
it. He is good in the box. He's very clever with his feet, but that's an element that he has that Thuram doesn't have. It's almost like in football we use the analogy of lightning and thunder with running backs, right? The small running back who's quick versus the big powerful one who's going to bust through the hole. It's similar to these two because Thuram is a quick pacier guy. Arnautovic is going to be the guy in the box holding up the play, kind of send up his teammates when he can or going for the goal. There's different type strikers, but they work for Inter, and Lautaro just feeds off both of them.
Roma, there's absolutely no way on earth that when they play Inter, Milan, Napoli, the top teams in Italy, there's no way on earth they're going to play. The script is going to have them possessing the ball for 72% of the game like they did against Hellas Verona and 60% against Salernitana. Now, if I'm Inter and Milan and Napoli, I'd sure as hell go ahead and tell Roma, here, you have the ball, because you want to know why? You can counter them. And you want to know why you can counter them? Chris Smalling is taking a step back.
Yeah.
He's on his heels. He's reacting. For the second straight week, he's beaten in the 1v1 and concedes a goal. Ngonje's quicker than him, so I can excuse it. But Kandreva? I'm still scratching my head at that one. When Roma and Milan meet on Friday, because Milan want to have the ball and they want to possess it, right? Roma's going to play a lot of low block. They're going to protect Smalling. They're going to protect some of these defenders who have had their struggles. I fully expect that when they play on Friday. But I can't really make a full judgment on Roma, except I hate seeing them when they have a lion's share of possession because they're leaking cheap goals going the other way. That's it. I hate it if I'm a Roma supporter because I'm worried about a good team that can counter them. And Hellas Verona is still not a good team, even though they've won 2 games here. Okay, they've kind of take into the fashion in which they've won them.
They have as many wins as we thought they'd have this year.
They've reached their quota exactly. So. In that sense, I still think Roma's a little bit of an incomplete. What I do know about them is that they better not get into games where they're looking to dominate possession, because when they're stretched and they're beaten, they're in trouble.
Yeah. Well, for sure about Inter. Oh, what's this? Napoli's gonna dominate possession in any game unless they're playing like Man City, right? So I don't expect anybody to compete with them when it comes to possession. We talk about Inter, and. Big fella here says a good question. He says Inter has a better squad this year than last year. I agree with that. I do agree with that.
I'm with him.
Cialanoglu's got a new facet to him himself. But I think, at least with the 2 Milanese clubs, when Roma plays these teams, the possession won't be, I don't think it'll be lopsided either way. I think Milan and Inter will both try to give up some possession, but it'll be more like 50-50, 55-45 in that range. I'm interested to see. I fully expect Mourinho to figure out a way to stop what Milan's bread and butter has been through the first 2 games, meaning the late runners, whether it's Pulisic, RLC, whoever else is coming on the back end, and it's going to probably have to be like a Leao and Teo show in this regard. Maybe even Giroud, because he's the big game player. But we'll see what Roma's made of. I mean, the way they're playing at the moment, you're thinking when they play, any of the top teams in the league, it's not going to look pretty. But Mourinho does find ways to find your strength to make it a weakness. And force you to beat them in other ways. And so I fully expect that from Roma. As one of the comments said, I think Dino said in the chat, like, hopefully Lukaku doesn't play, for our sake, Lukaku doesn't play, because he does play well against Milan. He can get between the center backs who are not that big and strong. He can bully his way around as he has in the past. Is he healthy enough to do that? I don't know, but he has that always in him. So hopefully we don't see him, but that's going to be an interesting chess match there between Pioli and Mourinho, and I fully expect that to be a tight game. Though I expect Milan to win, I think it's going to be a lot closer than the first couple games for Milan, I think. But it'll be certainly a fascinating aspect. And Roma have to pick it up. Not only did the goal scoring, I think Pellegrini's been playing really well so far this year, but the rest of the team, the defense has got to pick up. Terracciano has been okay so far. He's got to warm up to this team, get used to his new players. Spinazzola doesn't look quite himself just yet. And Cristante, to his credit, he looks okay for him. All right, but Roma's not there yet. But it'll take time, hopefully, for them.
It's yeah, maybe the parts need to come together a little bit too. To your
Hey,
point,
all Juve cast in the chat.
that's good to hear. Good to have them and good to have them in there. Um, so we just that's a concern I have about Roma. I have that concern about Fiorentina. Although Fiorentina is going to want to keep possession and they'll take their chances. I mean,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
so um, so that's something that you have to think about. But that's where I'm at with some of these teams right now. I mean, I think that Milan beat two mid-table teams fairly comfortably. Coming back to them, two teams that I think that they dropped points against last season.
Yeah.
And people will sit there and say, well, let's see if they, it's one thing to do it against them, but it's another thing to do it against the Seven Sisters or the better teams. Well,
Yeah.
you better do it against them. I'm sitting as like, it was like just kind of making a comparison, but National Football League, the Steelers run undefeated in the preseason, but Kenny Pickett got to play against the backups and third stringers.
Same thing with the Commanders.
And he drove. Yeah, he had five touchdown. He played 5 series and scored 5 touchdowns. But don't you want him to score touchdowns against? Because if they don't, and if they're not executing against the 2s and 3s, it's not going to look good when you have to play against the better players. So Same thing here. If Milan are going to be ready to play against the big teams and try to reclaim this Scudetto, these are the performances and the statements that they need to make.
Napoli are telling you Napoli did this all last year. They took care of what they had to on the lower teams, and they're showing so far this season they can do the same thing again. So anybody's going to compete with Napoli this year, and I've had my comments about Rudy Garcia this year and my worries about him, but Napoli are still a good solid core of a team that they had same team they had last year. They can handle these teams, and so if you want to compete with them, the Milans, the Inters, the Juves, whoever, you have to beat these teams that are below you in the table. And what we've seen so far this year, well, last year Inter and Milan could not do that. They struggled, and that's why they finished where they finished in the table, so far behind Napoli. So far, so good. It's what you want to do, what you want to see. They look comfortable in both those games, so that's a good start. Again, both those teams are traditionally struggle against these teams that are provincial teams. For some reason, they find a way to blow the game. They haven't done this. They look fairly solid overall. So you want to see more of that. And again, with any of these big teams, until they face each other, and the first test is this Friday for Milan and Roma. How do they do against each other, against the Seven Sisters? That's the true test. We said that last year with Napoli to start the season. Yeah, they looked on fire against the provincial teams. We said, what did they look like against a top Seven Sister? First game against Milan, a hell of a game where they won 2-1 at the San Siro, and Cavada had a really great game, and so did Osimhen. Osimhen didn't even play the first game, and that's when you're like, okay, look, maybe Napoli is for real. They can play. They can play at a dangerous venue. So we'll see how as these weeks progress and how these matchups come on, how these teams fare. But it's going to be interesting to see how the Romas and Lazios, Atalantas of the world compete against these other Seven Sisters that are at the higher end of the Seven Sister list.